The door had barely closed behind her when the general's voice cut through the room. It was not loud. Men like General Arthur Cope rarely needed volume. They had spent decades learning that authority worked best at low temperature, delivered in a tone that made the air around it go still. And so when he leaned toward the aide on his left and asked, "Who let the worker in here?" the words moved through that conference room, the way cold water moves through a crack in stone, quiet, precise, and capable of doing real damage. Nobody laughed. That was important. Not a single person around that table laughed, because laughing would have been too obvious, too easily remembered. Instead, they did what people in powerful rooms have always done. When something uncomfortable floats to the surface, they looked away. They studied their folders, adjusted their water glasses, found something extraordinarily interesting about the grain of the mahogany table. The colonel to Cope's right allowed himself the smallest possible movement at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile. Something more careful than that. She had heard it. Of course she had heard it. The room was not that large, and General Cope was not actually trying to be quiet. He was trying to be quiet in the way that people try to be quiet when they want to be heard by everyone except the person they are talking about. Her name was Laura Kane. She was 38 years old, 5'6", and she wore the standard-issue badge lanyard of a defense contractor, the kind you could buy assumptions off of, the way you could buy a newspaper, cheaply and in bulk. Her boots were scuffed at the left toe from a site visit 3 weeks ago at a facility in Nevada that she was not allowed to describe to anyone who had not signed 3 separate non-disclosure documents. Her jacket was practical. Her hair was in a simple knot. There was nothing about her appearance that announced itself, which was, for the record, entirely by design. She had walked into that room at 0800 hours, carrying a single leather portfolio and a small encrypted drive in her left jacket pocket. She had nodded to the men already seated, found her chair, 2 seats from the head of the table, and set her portfolio down without ceremony. She had done this kind of thing before. This specific experience, the experience of walking into a room and being the element that did not compute, was not new information. It was, if she was being precise about it, a recurring feature of her professional life, like weather, like traffic, like the particular sound that a room makes when it decides you do not belong in it. General Cope had not looked at her when she came in. He had been talking to a colonel named Griffith about something related to a supply chain issue in the eastern region, and he had continued that conversation for 4 minutes after she sat down, which was also not new. She had opened her portfolio, uncapped her pen, and written the date at the top of her notepad in small, neat numbers. She had noted the exit doors. She had noted who was sitting where, and what rank sat at which chair. She had done this not from anxiety, but from habit. The kind of habit that becomes so deep it stops feeling like a habit, and just feels like paying attention. And then the door had opened again and 2 more men had come in, a brigadier general named Paul Stokes, and a civilian advisor whose name Laura already knew from the briefing document she had read on the flight in. And that was when General Cope had done his accounting. He had looked around the table the way a man looks around a table when he is deciding whether the room is correct, whether the people in it are the correct people. And his eyes had moved across Laura the way eyes move across furniture, not dismissively exactly, but without recognition, without the small adjustment the brain makes when it encounters someone it has categorized as relevant. And then he had asked his question, quiet, low temperature, to the aide on his left. "Who let the worker in here?" Laura did not stop writing. She finished the sentence she was completing in her notepad, a brief notation about the agenda point she expected to come second, and then she capped her pen. She set it parallel to the edge of her portfolio. She folded her hands on the table. She looked at nothing in particular. She had learned, through years of exactly this kind of experience, that the first thing you should not do is react from the place the insult lands, because that place is exactly where you are least able to think clearly. So she waited. She let the words finish their journey through the room. She let the silence after them settle. General Arthur Cope was 61 years old and had served 34 years in the military. He had a wall of decorations that would have required its own wall in any reasonable home. He had commanded operations in 3 different continents. He had testified before congressional committees. He had been photographed with 4 different presidents. He was not, by any measure anyone in that room would have used, a small man. He was the kind of man who had spent so long being confirmed by the world around him that the confirming had become invisible to him. He no longer needed to notice it. It was simply the water he moved through. He had looked at Laura Kane, and he had not recognized what he was looking at, and so he had named it the only way available to him from the catalog of things he had learned to see. Worker. Someone who had wandered in from a different category. Someone who was in the wrong room. The aide on his left, a young captain named Drew Morton, had checked his folder. He had found the briefing document. He had looked at the name on the page, looked at the woman sitting 2 chairs from the head of the table, and then done the thing that young captains learn to do in the presence of generals who have just said something that cannot be unsaid in front of witnesses. He had very quietly cleared his throat and said nothing. That, in itself, was an answer. Laura Kane's badge hung face down against the front of her jacket. It had been that way since she walked in. Not deliberately, not strategically. She had simply not thought to flip it. She thought about it now. She thought about the specific information printed on that badge, about the clearance codes and the classification level, and the 3-letter designation at the top that had a way of making rooms go very quiet when the right people saw it. She thought about all of that, and she decided she would wait. She was good at waiting. She had always been good at waiting. It was, she had come to understand, one of the most underrated forms of power available to anyone who had ever been told, in whatever language the telling took, that their presence in a given space required explanation. The meeting was supposed to begin at 08:15. It was now 08:12. She had 3 minutes, and she used them to sit with the particular quality of silence that had settled over the room after General Cope's question, a silence that was doing its own kind of work, separating the people who were uncomfortable from the people who were merely pretending to be, marking the ones who had heard it from the ones who would later claim they had not quite caught what he said. Brigadier General Stokes, who had come in with the civilian advisor and who had sat down at the far end of the table, looked at Laura once. It was a direct look, brief, and it carried something in it that she catalogued without making anything of it. She had learned not to make too much of allies who announced themselves with a look, when what she actually needed was whatever came after the look she would see. General Cope finished his water. He set the glass down. He looked at his watch. He was ready to begin. It was 08:14, 1 minute early. And then the aide, Captain Drew Morton, leaned toward him and said, in the lowest voice he could manage while still being audible, "General, the lead briefer is already seated." Cope looked at him. Morton glanced, almost imperceptibly, toward Laura. The general turned his head. He looked at her, fully this time, in a way he had not done when she first walked in. He looked at the portfolio, the pen, the folded hands, the badge hanging face down against her jacket, and for the first time since she had entered the room, General Arthur Cope actually saw her. Not the contractor, not the worker, not the thing that didn't fit the geometry of the room. Her. It lasted only a moment. Then his face arranged itself back into its usual configuration, and he sat back in his chair, and he looked at his agenda folder, and he did not say anything else. Laura Kane uncapped her pen. The meeting came to order. She had a lot to say. The story of how Laura Kane came to be sitting at that table, in that specific room, on that particular morning, is not a story that begins with a single decision, or a single moment of vision. It does not begin with a young girl who dreamed of working in classified defense facilities. That version of the story would be simpler and cleaner and almost entirely untrue. What is true is that Laura grew up in a small town called Birch Falls in upstate New York, the kind of town where the main street had 3 churches and a diner and a post office, where everyone's last name eventually connected to someone else's last name if you went back far enough, and where the idea of a career in anything resembling national defense work would have prompted, in most living rooms on most evenings, a polite but genuine confusion about what exactly that meant, and whether it paid well enough to justify itself. Her father, Ray Kane, worked for the county roads department for 26 years. He was a precise man in the way that people who work with measurements and materials tend to become precise. He believed in things being done correctly the first time. He believed that knowing how something worked was the beginning of being able to make it work better. He spent many hours of Laura's childhood explaining to her, in patient detail, exactly how things functioned. The engine of the family truck, the water pressure system in the house, the load calculations behind a bridge they drove over once on a camping trip. He was not trying to teach her engineering. He was just someone who thought that the world made more sense once you understood the structure underneath it, and he could not see a reason to keep that understanding to himself. Her mother, Gloria Kane, was a middle school librarian for 30 years. She was a reader, in the deep sense, not someone who read for escape, but someone who read the way some people eat, as a fundamental act of staying alive and oriented. She believed, as a matter of working principle, that the most important thing she could give the children who came through her library was not any particular book, but the confidence that the information they needed existed somewhere, and that they were allowed to go looking for it. She had very little patience for the idea that certain kinds of knowledge were not for certain kinds of people. Laura was their only child. She inherited her father's interest in how things functioned, and her mother's conviction that she was allowed to go looking. She was not the loudest student in any of her classes. She was not the one who raised her hand most often, or who made herself most visible. She was the one who, when given a problem, went away and thought about it until she understood it from the inside. Her math teacher in 7th grade, a tired but perceptive man named Mr. Owen, wrote on her year-end report that Laura had a quality he could not quite name, but that he thought of as structural intelligence, meaning she did not just find the answer, she found the architecture the answer was sitting in. She did well in high school without being exceptional. Exceptional would have required performance, and Laura was not interested in performance. She was interested in the actual thing. She applied to one college, the State University 3 hours south, got in, chose electrical engineering because it was the closest academic category to the thing her father had been quietly teaching her since she was 8 years old, and moved into a dorm room in September, with 2 suitcases and a soldering kit her father had given her as a going-away present. College is where things started to clarify, or more accurately, where certain things that had always been true became visible, because the contrast sharpened. She was very often the only woman in her engineering classes, or one of 2, or one of 3. This was not, in 2004, a new phenomenon in electrical engineering, and the institution had long since made its peace with it, in the way that institutions make peace with things they have not actually resolved, by acknowledging the statistic while leaving the atmosphere largely unchanged. The atmosphere was not hostile, not in any explicit or overt way. It was just calibrated for someone else. The casual assumptions, the unconscious defaults, the way group projects organized themselves, the way office hours went, the way social capital moved through a department, all of it had a center of gravity that was not where she was standing. She did not spend a great deal of time being angry about this. Anger required a specific kind of energy she preferred to spend on the work. She spent it on the work. She was thorough where others were quick. She was methodical where others were intuitive. She checked her conclusions twice, not because she doubted them but because she had learned, early and practically, that in environments where you are not the default, your errors are weighted differently. A mistake that would be shrugged off as a learning moment in someone else became, for her, an opportunity for someone to locate confirmation of what they already suspected. She was not willing to provide that opportunity, so she checked twice. She graduated in the top 8% of her class. She was recruited by 3 defense contractors in the spring semester of her senior year. She took the offer from a firm called Caldwell Technical because their work was the most complex, and because the interviewer, a woman in her 50s named Ruth Abrams who ran their Northeast Engineering Division, had asked her a technical question in the first 10 minutes of the interview that nobody at the other 2 firms had come close to asking. Laura had answered it in detail. Ruth had nodded once and said, "Good." That was it. That was the whole audition. The early years at Caldwell were what they were. She was competent in ways that went unnoticed, and capable in ways that were occasionally noticed by the right people, and more regularly noticed by the wrong ones. There was a project manager in her second year named Gary Whitfield who scheduled her out of a briefing she should have been in because, as he put it to a colleague in a hallway conversation Laura passed on her way to the coffee station, he was not sure she had the technical background for the level of discussion. She had been the one who drafted the technical section of the report the briefing was about. She did not say this to Gary Whitfield. She went back to her desk and sent an email to Ruth Abrams, documented what had happened, and continued working on the next section. Ruth Abrams, for her part, was not a person who moved quickly on anything. She was a person who moved precisely. 3 weeks later, Gary Whitfield was managing a different project, and Laura was in the briefing, presenting the section she had written, to a room of people who did not know, and were not told why there had been a change in personnel. That was how Ruth operated, not with drama, with correction. Over the next decade, Laura Kane became very good at something that did not have a clean job title. She could look at a complex technical system, identify where its failures were likely to occur before they occurred, and design the countermeasures that prevented them. This sounds straightforward when described in a sentence. It was not straightforward. It required a combination of engineering depth, systems thinking, pattern recognition, and a kind of patient fearlessness about complexity that very few people had, and that almost no institution could formally teach. She had it. She had always had it. It just took the right kind of problem to make it fully visible. By the time she was 32, she had worked on projects at 4 different classification levels, had co-authored 2 technical assessments that had been incorporated into federal planning documents, and had received a security clearance that most people who had heard of it would have assumed belonged to someone with more stars on their shoulder. She had not sought the clearance for what it meant on paper. She had sought it because the work she needed to do required access to the information it unlocked. She had also learned, with increasing precision, what it cost to be her in the rooms she entered. It was not a cost she could itemize or invoice. It was the cost of extra preparation, of arriving 10 minutes early to understand the terrain before anyone else arrived. It was the cost of reading every person in a room in the first 90 seconds to know where the skepticism was sitting and how to route around it without appearing to. It was the cost of maintaining a stillness in the face of dismissal that did not come from not caring, but from knowing that caring loudly in that moment would be the most expensive thing she could do. She was 35 when she first briefed a room containing a general officer. It had been a smaller room than the one in this story, and the general in question, a woman named Pat Holloway who ran a logistics command, had listened to the entire briefing without speaking, and then asked 2 questions, both of which were exactly the right questions, and at the end had said, without warmth or ceremony, that it was useful work. Laura had walked out of that building, driven to the airport, sat in the departure lounge, and eaten a sandwich with a composure she had maintained for 6 years. Then she called her mother from a payphone because her phone battery was dead, and said, in a voice that was more level than she had expected, that she thought things were going all right. Gloria Kane had said, because she was a woman who had spent 30 years pointing children toward the information they needed, that she had never doubted it. In the 3 years between that briefing and the morning she walked into General Arthur Cope's conference room, Laura Kane had led 6 separate technical assessments, 2 of which had directly influenced acquisition decisions worth hundreds of millions of dollars. She had testified twice in closed session before a subcommittee. She had trained 4 junior engineers, 2 of whom had since been recruited into programs she was not cleared to ask about. She had done all of this without ever once being the person in the room that anyone would have predicted, walking in, was about to tell them something they needed to know. She had arrived at the conference room at 07:49 that morning, 11 minutes before she needed to be there. She had introduced herself to the aide at the door, given her name, shown her badge, and been led to her seat. She had noted the decor, the flag arrangement, the setup of the room, all of the things her father had taught her to notice about the structure underneath what you were looking at. She had placed her portfolio on the table and written the date in small, neat numbers at the top of her notepad. And then General Cope had walked in, and the room had come to order around him, the way rooms do when the person with the most authority arrives, and he had looked around the table to confirm that the geometry of the room was correct. And his eyes had moved across her without stopping. And then he had leaned toward his aide and asked, in that quiet, low-temperature voice that had been delivering verdicts for 34 years, who had let the worker in here? And Laura Kane had finished her sentence, and capped her pen, and folded her hands, and waited. She was very good at waiting. The meeting was about to begin. When the meeting came to order, Laura Kane did not announce herself. She did not clear her throat, or adjust her posture, or do any of the things people do when they are trying to signal importance. She simply opened her portfolio, found the first page of her briefing notes, and set her pen parallel to the edge of the table. She was ready. She had been ready since 0749. General Arthur Cope ran the opening 4 minutes of the meeting the way he ran everything. From the center of the room's attention, without effort, without ceremony, without needing to claim the space, because the space had long since learned to arrange itself around him. He reviewed the agenda. He acknowledged the presence of Brigadier General Paul Stokes at the far end of the table. He made 2 brief, clipped comments about a logistics update that had crossed his desk that morning. He did not look at Laura. The captain, Drew Morton, the aide on his left, had his briefing folder open and was tracking the agenda with the quiet efficiency of someone whose primary job was to make sure the general never had to ask where something was. Morton was 27, had been in his current posting for 8 months, and had spent those 8 months developing a very precise understanding of the difference between things he should bring to the general's attention immediately and things he should note quietly and let resolve themselves. He was still working out which category this morning's situation belonged in. The first agenda item was a supply chain review delivered by a colonel named William Grant. Grant was 52 and had the kind of steady, reliable presentation manner that came from having briefed in these rooms for 20 years. He was competent and organized and thorough, and he talked for 11 minutes about procurement timelines and material constraints, and 2 bottlenecks in the southeastern supply chain that were causing delays in a program Laura knew by a different name than the one being used in this room. She wrote 3 notes during Grant's briefing. 2 were technical questions she intended to raise later. 1 was a single word she underlined twice: redundancy. She circled the word and drew a small arrow from it to a note in the margin that read 14 weeks. When Grant finished, Cope asked 2 questions. Both were good questions, direct and specific, the kind that told you the person asking had actually listened. Laura revised her assessment of him slightly. Whatever else General Cope was, he was not disengaged from the substance of his work. The second agenda item was a personnel update. It lasted 6 minutes, and Laura was not involved in it, and she used those 6 minutes to review the 3rd section of her briefing document one more time, the section she had rewritten 4 times in the last 2 weeks, because the technical language kept wanting to be more technical than the room would need it to be, and she had kept pulling it back, simplifying, without losing the precision, which was the hardest kind of writing she knew. And then Captain Morton looked at his agenda sheet and said, "Item 3, sir. Technical assessment briefing. Threat vector analysis. Presenter is Miss Laura Kane." And General Cope turned his head and looked at her. The room was quiet in the way that rooms are quiet when they have just been told to pay attention to something they had not expected. Laura Kane stood. She did not use her portfolio as a prop. She held 1 page of notes in her left hand, and she had her encrypted drive loaded on the room's display system, which she had confirmed with the technical aide at 0751, 14 minutes before the meeting began. She looked at the room, not past it, not over it, but at it, each person at the table for 1 second, the way you look at a room when you need the room to understand that what you are about to say was prepared for them specifically. She said, "What you have been calling a procurement delay is not a procurement delay." The room was very still. She continued. What she laid out in the next 47 minutes was a threat vector analysis that she had spent 9 months building, and that she had cross-referenced against 4 separate classification levels of intelligence data. It was not a simple thing. It was not designed to be alarming or dramatic. It was designed to be clear, which is the hardest thing a complicated analysis can be. She had identified a pattern of systemic vulnerabilities in 3 interconnected supply chain nodes that, when mapped against a separate dataset from a partner agency, produced a failure probability that was significantly higher than the numbers anyone in that room had been working with. She said this without flourish. She said it with exactly the precision it required, no more, because extra words in rooms like this one were a form of noise that reduced signal, and the signal she was carrying was the only thing that mattered. She explained the redundancy gap. She showed the 14-week window. She presented the countermeasure architecture she had built, which addressed the 3 nodes in sequence, and which had been reviewed and signed off by 2 separate technical boards, one of which operated at a clearance level that most of the colonels in the room did not have. Halfway through the briefing, she reached into her left jacket pocket and retrieved the encrypted drive's secondary documentation packet, and she set it on the table, and as she did, her lanyard swung forward, and the badge that had been hanging face down against the front of her jacket turned over. It took General Cope approximately 4 seconds to read what was on it. The 3-letter designation at the top. The clearance tier, printed in a specific font, that anyone who had worked at his level for more than 15 years would recognize immediately. The program codes beneath it, 2 of which Cope himself had only encountered in a document he had read in a secure facility 18 months ago, a document that had required its own set of protocols to access. He read it. He read it again. His expression did not change. It was the most carefully maintained expression in that room, which was a room containing a number of very practiced maintainers of expressions. But something shifted behind it, the kind of shift that happens when a thing you were certain of turns out to be a different shape than you thought it was, and the certainty you had built around it quietly restructures itself. Laura did not see him read the badge. She was looking at the display screen, pointing to the 3rd node in her analysis, with a laser pointer that needed a new battery, and was putting out about 80% of its normal brightness. She had noted this at 0755, but there had not been time to find a replacement battery, and so she was compensating by standing 3 inches closer to the screen than she would have otherwise. Colonel Griffith, seated to Cope's left, saw the badge. He leaned forward very slightly, and then returned to his previous posture. Brigadier General Stokes, at the far end of the table, had seen it from the moment Laura sat down, and he had said nothing, and he continued to say nothing, which was its own kind of statement. The person who reacted most visibly, which is to say with a small, almost imperceptible adjustment of the shoulders, was Captain Drew Morton. He looked at the badge, looked at his briefing folder, looked at the agenda item that said, Miss Laura Kane, Technical Assessment Briefing, Threat Vector Analysis, and then he looked at the table. He was 27, and he had 8 months in his current posting, and this morning had given him more to think about than the previous 8 months combined. Laura reached the final section of her briefing. She presented the recommended action sequence, the timeline, the resource allocation she was proposing, and the risk framework she had built to measure progress against. She said, without editorializing, that the window for the highest probability response was 14 weeks, and that what happened in those 14 weeks would determine the shape of the problem for the following 3 years. She stopped. She looked at the room. She said, I'm happy to take questions. For 2 seconds, nobody moved. It was not the silence of confusion or disagreement. It was the silence of a room that had just received a significant amount of information and was doing the necessary internal work of reorganizing around it. General Cope was the first to speak. He said, How confident are you in the 14-week figure? Not who are you, not how did you get in here, not who authorized this briefing. How confident are you in the 14-week figure? Laura said, Very. The dataset underneath it has a margin of error of less than 3%. Cope nodded once, the nod of someone who is used to making decisions from exactly this kind of input. He said, Walk me through the 2nd node again. And she did. She did walk him through the 2nd node again. She did it differently the 2nd time, not because the information was different, but because Cope's question had told her something about which part of the analysis he had not yet fully absorbed, and so she restructured the explanation around that gap, the way a good engineer restructures a load-bearing solution around the point of actual weakness. The 2nd node was the most technically complex part of the analysis. It involved a 3-way dependency between a manufacturing supplier, a logistics contractor, and a software verification system, and the vulnerability she had identified was not in any one of those 3 components, but in the space between them, in the assumption that all 3 were being monitored as a system, rather than as separate entities. They were not. They had been procured separately, maintained separately, and audited separately, which meant the failure mode that ran across all 3 of them simultaneously had never appeared in any individual audit, because it was invisible from inside any one component. She had found it by mapping all 3 simultaneously, which had required clearance to access 3 separate contractor systems that did not normally share information with one another, which had required its own 9 months of paperwork before the 9 months of actual analysis could begin. The paperwork was the part of the story nobody mentioned because the paperwork was where most people stopped and called the problem unsolvable. She had not stopped. She walked Cope through the dependency chain. She used the display screen and her slightly underpowered laser pointer and 2 pages of the printed documentation she had brought as backup. She was precise and she was patient, and she did not simplify the technical content to the point of misrepresentation, because misrepresenting technical content to make it easier to hear was the kind of helpfulness that was actually a failure, and she did not fail at briefings. Cope followed every word of it. This was, she was learning, one of his actual qualities. He was a man who listened to technical content with the same focused attention he gave to operational updates, which was not universal among people at his level. She had briefed generals who delegated their technical understanding to aides, and then made decisions from summaries of summaries. Cope did not do that. Whatever his other qualities, his failings, his blind spots, and she had encountered at least one significant one already this morning, he was a man who wanted to understand the actual thing. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He had his pen in his hand and he was holding it without writing, which she recognized as the physical expression of a mind working through implications. He said, "And this vulnerability has been present for how long?" She said, "Based on the procurement timeline of the software verification system, at least 4 years, possibly longer." The room absorbed this. 4 years was a significant number. 4 years meant that every audit conducted in that period had not seen it. It meant that the problem had been sitting in the structure of the program, invisible, for 4 years. Colonel Alderman, who had been writing steadily since the start of the briefing, stopped writing. He looked at the display screen. Then he looked at Laura. He said, "How confident are you in the 4-year figure?" She said, "The procurement records are clear. That system was implemented 4 years and 3 months ago. The dependency structure it created was present from installation, so at minimum, 4 years." Alderman looked at Cope. Cope looked at the table. It was a particular kind of looking, the kind that means the person is not seeing the table, but is seeing something else through it, something inside their own understanding of the situation that has just changed shape. He said, "We had an internal review 14 months ago." She said, "I know. I read the report." She said it without inflection. It was a fact. She had read the report. The report had not found the vulnerability, not because the people who conducted it were incompetent, but because they had been looking inside each component rather than across the space between them. It was the same mistake that a very good doctor makes when they read 3 separate test results and none of them show anything abnormal, and the patient is still sick, because the illness lives in the relationship between the 3 systems rather than inside any one of them. She did not explain this analogy in the briefing. She filed it away for the follow-on meeting. She had learned when to use an analogy and when to let the fact carry itself. General Cope set his pen down. He looked at Laura with an expression she had seen on other faces in other rooms, the expression of a very competent person encountering the limit of their prior competence, the specific quality of attention that comes from realizing that the map you have been using is not the territory. He said, "How did you find it?" It was a genuine question, not defensive, not challenging, genuine, in the way of someone who wanted to understand a method that had produced a result their own methods had missed. She said, "I mapped all 3 systems at the same time, against the same timeline, looking for the points where their assumptions about each other were unverified. The vulnerability isn't in the systems, it's in the assumptions." He looked at her. She could not fully read his face, but she could read the quality of the silence that followed. And the silence said that he was revising something, not necessarily about her, possibly about the nature of the problem, about the kind of analysis that would have been required to find it, about what it meant that it had not been found sooner. Possibly about her too. She did not know, and she did not need to know. The analysis was the thing. The analysis was on the table. She said, "The good news is that the countermeasure architecture addresses the assumption gap directly, not just the surface vulnerabilities, which means the fix is structural, not patchwork." She brought up the final diagram. It was a clean visual. 3 nodes connected by verified monitoring lines, each line annotated with the specific protocol change she was recommending. It looked simple, because she had made it look simple. It had taken 4 months to make it look that simple. Cope looked at it for a long moment. Then he said, "What do you need from us to move forward?" Not if, what. The shift from if to what is a very specific kind of shift in a room like that one. It means a decision has been made inside someone's understanding, quietly and without announcement, the way the most durable decisions are made. She told him what she needed. She told him in the same clear, precise language she had been using for the last 47 minutes. She gave him the resource list, and the timeline, and the access requirements, and the reporting structure she was recommending. She gave it to him without asking whether he thought it was reasonable, because she knew it was reasonable, and she was not in the habit of performing uncertainty she did not feel. He wrote 2 things down. He underlined one of them. He said, "Questions for Miss Kane," and he looked around the table. The questions that followed were the second hour of the briefing's intellectual life. They were the questions that mattered, the ones that came from people who had listened hard enough to find the edges of their own understanding, and were now pressing on those edges. They were the best kind of questions, the ones that made the analysis sharper by forcing it to account for the places where it had not been tested by outside eyes. She answered all of them. She referred to her notes twice. She was direct when she was certain, and she was precise about the degree of her uncertainty when she was not, because false certainty in an analysis of this kind was the one failure mode she could not recover from. By the end, the room had the information, all of it. It was sitting on the table in the form of printed documentation, and a saved display file, and the notes that 7 people around that table had made in their own handwriting. It was no longer only in her head. It was in the room. It belonged to the room now, and to the decisions the room would make from it. She clicked off the laser pointer. She said, "That's everything. I'm happy to provide additional documentation in any format that's useful." Colonel Griffith said, "The technical annex. Can we get a full copy?" She said, "I'll have it to your office by end of week." And then Cope had said, "How confident are you in the 14-week figure?" And she had said, "Very. The dataset underneath it has a margin of error of less than 3%. And he had nodded, and he had said, "Walk me through the second note again." And she had. And then the questions had come, and she had answered them, and the room had the information, and the work was done. The questions went on for 31 minutes. They came from Cope, from Griffith, from Stokes, from a colonel named Ray Alderman who had been quiet through the entire briefing, and who turned out to have a very precise understanding of the second supply chain node, because he had worked a related procurement issue 2 years prior. The questions were good. Several of them were very good. Laura answered all of them without referring to her notes more than twice, because she had built this analysis from the inside out, and she knew every room in it. When the questions were done, the room went through a brief procedural moment, the kind where everyone recalibrates who is supposed to speak next, and nobody wants to be the one who misjudges it. Brigadier General Stokes filled it by leaning forward and saying, in a tone that was calm and precise, and not looking at anyone in particular, "This is exactly the kind of assessment this command needed and did not have." He paused. "Good work." That was Paul Stokes's style. He did not amplify things. He said the true thing in the smallest number of words available, and then he returned to his neutral posture. General Cope looked at his agenda folder. Then he looked up. He looked at Laura, and this time the look had a weight to it that the morning's earlier glance had entirely lacked. It was the look of a man who had spent 34 years learning to assess the value of information, and who was now performing that assessment in real time on a situation he had misread. He said, "Miss Kane." Just that. Just her name. She looked at him. He did not say he was sorry. Men of General Arthur Cope's generation and rank and formation did not typically produce that word in a conference room in front of junior officers and colonels, not because they were incapable of it in every situation, but because the architecture of how they understood authority made that specific word in that specific context feel like a structural failure rather than a correction. She knew this. She had known it before she walked into the room. What he did instead was something she had not entirely anticipated. He said, "How long have you been working on this analysis?" She said, 9 months. He said, "And the countermeasure architecture, you built that independently or with a team?" She said, "Both. The framework is mine. The stress testing was done with a 3-person team at Caldwell over the last 4 months." He nodded. Not the single decisive nod of a decision, but a slower, more considered movement, the kind that means the information is being placed somewhere carefully. He said, "We should talk about follow-on work." It was not an apology. It was something more practical and more durable than an apology. It was a general officer sitting across a conference table from a defense contractor who had just demonstrated that his assessment of her was wrong, and choosing to engage the demonstrated reality rather than the prior assumption. Laura said, "I'd welcome that conversation." She said it without warmth or coldness. She said it the way you say a true thing, when you have been saying true things for the last 47 minutes, and the register hasn't changed. Colonel Griffith, who had been the one to allow that small movement at the corner of his mouth when Cope had first asked his question, was now looking at the surface of the table with a kind of focused attention that had nothing to do with the table. Captain Morton had stopped tracking the agenda and was writing something in his notebook that was not related to the meeting record. Cope watched Laura for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and then he looked at his folder, and then he moved to the next agenda item. The meeting had 3 more items. Laura sat through them and contributed once more. A brief technical clarification on an adjacent program that nobody had asked her about, but that her analysis touched on, which Colonel Alderman acknowledged with a nod and a short note. At the end, Cope stood, and the room stood with him, and he moved toward the door without ceremony, the way people move when they have somewhere else to be, and the meeting has done what it was supposed to do. At the door, he paused. He was holding his folder. He did not turn around completely. It was more of a half-turn, the movement of a man who has decided to say something, and is being precise about the angle of the saying. He said, "Kane." She was closing her portfolio. She looked up. He said, "The redundancy framework in Section 3. I want a full copy of the documentation on my desk by end of week." She said, "Yes, sir." He nodded, and he was gone. And the room began to empty with the particular efficiency of a room full of military personnel who have been told, by the departure of the most senior person, that the formal portion of the morning is over. Brigadier General Stokes, passing her chair on the way out, slowed just enough to say, in a voice no one else was close enough to catch, "Welcome back," and then he was gone. It was an odd phrase, "Welcome back." She was not sure what it meant, or whether it was a reference to something specific or simply the kind of shorthand that senior officers used when they wanted to acknowledge something without the architecture of a full sentence. She filed it away and returned to closing her portfolio. Captain Morton came to her as she was gathering her things. He was formal, standing correctly, not doing the thing that people sometimes did, which was to be awkward about a situation they had been adjacent to and did not know how to address. He said, "Ms. Kane, I'll confirm the follow-on meeting request through your firm's liaison by end of week." He paused. "Is there anything you need from us in the meantime, ma'am?" She said, "Just the documentation confirmation once it's been logged." He said, "Understood. We'll have that to you by Friday." He started to leave. Then he stopped. He was 27, and he had 8 months in his current posting, and he was still working out, Laura reflected, what kind of officer he was going to be. This was probably a useful morning for that project. He said, "Thank you for the briefing, Miss Kane." She looked at him. He was earnest in the way that very young people are earnest when they are trying to do a right thing, in a context that does not provide a clear script for it. She appreciated it. It was not nothing. She said, "Do your job well, Captain." It was not unkind. It was something more specific than kindness. She was not sure he understood it. She thought he might, eventually. She picked up her portfolio and her encrypted drive, and she walked to the door. And she walked through it, and down the corridor toward the security checkpoint, without looking back at the room she had just been in. She had said what she came to say. They had the analysis. The 14-week window was real, and now the people who needed to know about it knew about it, and the countermeasures she had designed were on their way to a desk where decisions could be made from them. That was the job. That was the entirety of the job. She handed her visitor badge to the security officer at the checkpoint and waited for him to log her out and return her identification. The corridor was quiet at this hour. The overhead lights were the particular shade of institutional white that was the same in every secure facility she had ever been in, on 4 continents, over 16 years. She thought about what Stokes had said. "Welcome back." She turned the phrase over once, and then set it down. It would make sense or it wouldn't, and either way the work was done. She walked out of the building into the morning air, which was cold and clear and indifferent to rank, and she took a breath, and she found her car in the visitor lot, and she drove toward the airport. She had a flight at 13:40. She had already started thinking about the follow-on. The drive to the airport took 40 minutes. It was flat country along that route, the kind of landscape that gives you nothing to look at, and so gives you everything to think. She drove with the radio off, which was how she drove when she was processing something. She was processing this morning. She was not, she told herself with some precision, processing the comment Cope had made. She was processing the meeting. The two things were connected, but they were not the same thing. The comment was old information. She had been carrying that kind of information in various forms for 16 years, and she had learned that the only way to carry it without it weighing too much was to keep it separate from the work. The work was the work. The comment was something else. She was choosing, as she had chosen many times before, not to let the something else contaminate the work. What she was processing, specifically, was the question Cope had asked at the end. How did you find it? The genuine quality of it. The absence of defensiveness. She had met people in his position who could not ask that question, not because they were incapable of it in every context, but because asking it in a room full of junior officers felt like a structural admission, like saying aloud that someone else had seen something they had not seen. She understood the psychology of that, even if she did not have a great deal of patience for it. The hierarchy that those rooms ran on was a hierarchy of demonstrated competence, or at least it was supposed to be, and that hierarchy had a way of calcifying around the people who had been at the top of it for long enough that the demonstration was no longer required. Cope had asked the question. She was thinking about what that meant for the follow-on work. She turned onto the airport access road. The morning had gone long and she had 40 minutes before her flight and she wanted coffee. She had not eaten anything since the hotel at 06:30, and the hotel's idea of breakfast had been a small cup of yogurt and a croissant that had been optimistic about its own freshness. She parked and walked into the terminal and found the coffee stand past the security checkpoint and ordered a large black coffee and a sandwich. She did not look at very closely because she was already thinking about the follow-on analysis and the part of it she had left out of the original scope. She found a seat in the departure lounge. The gate for her flight was 2 rows away, and the board showed it on time. She had 22 minutes. She opened her laptop. The part of the analysis she had left out was something she had noticed in month 7 of the 9-month process. A thread in the data that connected the third node to a procurement pattern she had seen in a different program 2 years earlier. She had set it aside because it was outside the scope she had been given, and because she had not yet had enough data to say anything about it, with the confidence level she required before she said anything to anyone. She did not present findings she was not confident in. That was a professional standard she held without exception. But in the 6 weeks since the meeting, the thread had not gone away. It had developed. She had been pulling on it quietly, in the hours between other work, building the dataset around it the way she built all her datasets, carefully, and from the inside out, checking every assumption against the primary source before she allowed herself to draw a conclusion from it. What she had now was not yet a complete analysis. What she had was the beginning of one, a structure with a foundation and the first 2 walls, and a very clear sense of what the roof was going to look like when she got there. What the roof was going to look like was not good. She wrote the outline. She wrote it in the same small, neat numbers she used for everything, the notation system that she had developed in graduate school and refined over 16 years until it was entirely her own, compact and precise and illegible to anyone who had not spent a long time around her work. She had 3 pages of it by the time her gate began boarding. She closed the laptop. She gathered her things. She joined the line for boarding, which was orderly and unhurried, a group of people in various states of tiredness, moving toward a plane that would take them somewhere they needed to be. The man in front of her in the line was reading something on his phone with the expression of someone who had received information they were not pleased about. The woman behind her was having a quiet, patient conversation with a child who wanted to know if the plane had a pilot or if it flew by itself. The child's mother said it had a pilot. The child wanted to know if the pilot was good. The mother said yes, the pilot was very good. Laura thought about the 3-letter designation on her badge, and about the 4-year vulnerability sitting in the structure of a program that had been audited and reviewed and signed off on by people whose competence she did not doubt, and about the roof of the analysis she had not yet finished building, and about the 14-week window that had already been counted down by 6 weeks. And she thought, the pilot is good. Yes, but the good pilot needs accurate instruments. She was the instrument. She had always been the instrument. Not the authority in the room, not the name on the organizational chart, not the person the aide confirmed at the door. The instrument, the tool that produced the reading, that made the decisions possible.
That was the job.
That was the whole job. And it was a large enough job to take up an entire career and then some. And she had chosen it with her eyes open, and she had never stopped choosing it. And she would not stop now. She boarded the plane. She found her seat, which was the window seat she always booked. Not for the view, but because it was the seat with the clearest sight line to the exit. She put her bag under the seat in front of her, and her laptop bag in the overhead, and she buckled her belt, and she opened the window shade, and looked out at the tarmac, and the ground crew, moving around the plane in their ordered, purposeful way. She had a flight at 13:40. She had already started thinking about the follow-on. 6 weeks after the morning in that conference room, the countermeasure program that Laura Kane had designed was formally authorized and funded. The authorization moved through the approval process at a speed that people who worked in defense procurement described as unusual, and people who worked in threat response described as barely fast enough. The 14-week window she had identified proved, in the months that followed, to have been not pessimistic but accurate. The third supply chain node developed a partial failure at week 11, which was caught and contained through the redundancy framework she had built, at a fraction of the cost and disruption that would have resulted from the alternative. Nobody wrote about this in any newspaper. Nobody was quoted about it in any public statement. It existed in a set of classified documents that would not be reviewed by outside eyes for a long time, and in the memories of the people who had been in the room on that morning, and in the practical reality of a program that continued to function because the architecture designed to protect it had done its job. General Arthur Cope requested a follow-on briefing through the formal channels, as he had said he would. It was scheduled 3 weeks after the initial meeting and took place in a different room, smaller, with fewer people, which was a choice Laura noticed and noted. Cope had brought Griffith and Alderman and a civilian technical advisor named Frank Okafor, who had been read into the analysis documents in the intervening weeks, and who arrived with 6 pages of specific technical questions that were the best 6 pages of specific technical questions Laura had encountered in a long time. The briefing went for 2 hours. Cope was different in this room, not fundamentally different, not a different person from the one who had leaned toward his aide and asked who let the worker in here, but different in the particular way of a person who has received accurate information about a situation they had incorrectly assessed and who has made a practical decision to proceed from the accurate information rather than the prior assessment. This was, she knew, not a universal quality. She had been in rooms with people who did not do this, who received accurate information and found ways to continue operating from the incorrect prior. Those rooms were harder. This one was not that. Toward the end of the second hour, Cope said something that she had not expected. They were working through the risk framework on the second node, and he had asked a question about the failure probability metric, and she had answered it, and there was a pause. And then he said, not looking at her directly, looking at the diagram on the table between them, I've worked in this building for 6 years. I thought I knew what this program's vulnerabilities looked like. He was quiet for a moment. He said, I didn't. It was not an apology. She had already decided she did not need one, which was a thing she had been deciding in variations for 16 years. The decision that she was not going to carry the weight of other people's corrections on their behalf. The correction itself, the actual revision of the assessment, was what mattered. The word sorry was the wrapping paper. She was interested in what was in the box. What was in the box was a general officer who was now working from her analysis rather than his prior assumption. What was in the box was a countermeasure program that was authorized and funded and moving. What was in the box was an encrypted drive containing 9 months of work that was doing the thing it was designed to do. She said, the data isn't always in the expected places. He looked at her then. It was a direct look. The look of someone who understood that they had just been offered a door and was deciding whether to take it. He took it. He said, no, I'm finding that out. Frank Okafor, across the table, did not react to this exchange. He was looking at his 6 pages of questions and making a note beside the one he had just gotten the answer to. Colonel Alderman was reviewing the risk framework diagram. Griffith was writing something, and had been writing something for the last several minutes, and showed no sign of stopping. The meeting concluded with an action list. 7 items, 4 of which were Laura's to lead, 3 of which were internal to the command. They agreed on a reporting cadence, and a secure communication protocol, and a review date for the Week 14 assessment. Everyone wrote down what they needed to write down. The room separated with the clean efficiency of people who have agreed on what happens next. In the corridor afterward, Frank Okafor fell into step beside her. He was a tall man, careful in his movements, with the kind of technical precision in his speech that told you he had spent many years translating between engineering reality and institutional language. He said, "The redundancy framework in Section 3. That's the most elegant solution to a multi-node failure scenario I've seen in 8 years in this field." She said, "Thank you." He said, "Did you have a team for that section, or was that yours?" She said, "Mine." He nodded. It was the nod of a person who already suspected the answer and was confirming it for their own purposes. He said, "I run a technical working group that reviews defense system vulnerability assessments. We meet 4 times a year. I'd like to invite you." She looked at him. He was not performing anything. He was making a practical professional decision based on demonstrated capability. She said, "Send me the details." He said, "I will." They reached the security checkpoint and went through the process of logging out, and then they were outside, and the day was overcast and cold, and they went in different directions toward different cars. She drove to the airport. She had a 16:40 flight, and she had time, so she sat in the departure lounge and she ordered coffee, and she opened her laptop and she began a preliminary outline for the follow-on analysis she had already started building in her head during the second briefing, the part of the problem that the current countermeasure framework addressed, but that had an adjacent vulnerability she had not included in the first 9 months of work, because it had been outside the original scope, and she had a habit of respecting scope until the scope needed to be reconsidered. She thought the scope needed to be reconsidered. The departure lounge was busy in the way that airport departure lounges are busy in the middle of the afternoon, full of people moving from one place to another, for reasons that had nothing to do with each other. A man in a business suit was reading a novel with a bent cover. 2 women in running clothes were arguing in a friendly way about a flight connection. A child was pressing her face against the window to look at the planes. Laura drank her coffee and wrote the outline. She wrote in the same small, neat numbers she used for dates, precise and compressed and entirely her own. She was already past the question of whether she was allowed to be in this room. That question, in its various forms, had followed her through 16 years, and 4 continents and more conference rooms than she could easily count, and she had arrived, somewhere in the middle of all of it, at the only answer that had ever been worth holding on to. She had always been allowed. She had always been exactly where she was supposed to be. The question had never been a real question. It had been noise, and she had learned to hear the signal underneath it, the way her father had taught her, years ago in that small town in upstate New York, that the world made more sense once you understood the structure underneath it. The structure underneath it was simple. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. The work she produced was real, and it mattered, and it was being used to protect something that needed protecting, and no question asked, in a low voice across a conference table, by any number of people who had not looked at her closely enough, had ever changed that, or could change it. The child at the window had found an airplane she liked and was pointing at it with great confidence. Laura finished her outline, closed her laptop, and waited for her flight. She had a lot of work to do. She was looking forward to it. The technical working group that Frank Okafor ran met for the first time with Laura in attendance, at the end of the second month following the initial briefing. It convened in a smaller facility, a conference suite at a research institute that was not a military installation, but that operated under a memorandum of understanding with 3 agencies, whose names appeared on very few public documents. The group had 11 members when Laura joined it. It had been running for 4 years. The members of the group were the kind of people who did not introduce themselves by listing their credentials. They introduced themselves by asking the technical question they were most interested in, which was the method Frank had established in the first meeting 4 years ago, because he had found, through experience, that a person's credentials told you what they had done, and a person's question told you how they thought, and how they thought was the thing that mattered in a room like this one. Laura's question, when it was her turn, was this. In a multi-node dependency system, what's the most reliable method for identifying failure modes that are invisible from inside any individual node? The room was quiet for a moment after she said it. Not the uncomfortable quiet of a room that doesn't know what to do with something. The thoughtful quiet of a room that has just heard a question it would like to spend time with. A woman named Carol Pemberton, who had been with the group since the beginning, and who designed reliability frameworks for a living, said, "That's the question, isn't it?" And then she asked it back, "What do you think?" And Laura told her, she spent 12 minutes laying out the approach she had used in the 9-month analysis, the simultaneous multi-system mapping, the assumption gap identification, the way she had structured the cross-referencing between systems that did not normally share their data. She did not present it as a fully formed methodology. She presented it as a working approach that had produced results in one context and that she wanted to stress test against other contexts. The group spent the rest of that first meeting doing exactly that. They took her approach apart and put it back together, finding the places where it was robust and the places where it had gaps, suggesting modifications, testing it against the specific failure scenarios they had each encountered in their own work. It was the best 3 hours she had spent in a professional context in several years. Carol Pemberton said, at the end, "You should write this up. The full methodology, it needs to exist as a document." Laura said she had thought about it. Carol said, "Think faster." She wrote it up over the following 6 weeks, in the hours between other work, and on 2 flights, and on one Sunday morning, when she could not sleep, and sat at her kitchen table with coffee and a blank document, and started at the beginning. It was 22 pages when it was done, and it went through 4 drafts before she sent it to Frank, and Frank sent it to 2 reviewers in the group, and the reviewers sent it back with comments, and she revised it again, and the final version was 19 pages, and was formally circulated within the group, and then, through Frank, to 3 program offices that the group had relationships with. She did not know, at the time she wrote it, that the document would be referenced in 4 separate program reviews over the following 18 months, and that 2 of those reviews would credit it by title in their findings. She would not have written it differently if she had known. She had written it because it was accurate, and because accurate things that existed in the world were more useful than accurate things that only existed in her head. General Cope saw the document. He saw it because Frank Okafor sent it to the program office that had been working with Laura's original analysis, and the program office included it in a reading packet for a command review, and Cope read everything in his reading packets. He had been doing that for 34 years. He sent her an email. It was 3 sentences long. It said that the document was useful, and that it addressed a gap he had not had language for before reading it, and that he had forwarded it to the command's technical advisory staff. 3 sentences. No preamble, no ceremony. The email of a man who communicated the way he conducted meetings, with the specific efficiency of someone who had learned that the best thing you could do with language was use exactly as much of it as the situation required. She wrote back 2 sentences, that she said she was glad it was useful, and that she would send the follow-on documentation for the second node analysis when it was ready. She sent the follow-on analysis 8 weeks later. It was 41 pages, and it contained the roof she had seen in the airport departure lounge, completed, fully built, precise and clear, and carrying the same 3% margin of error as the original. The pattern she had been following since month 7 of the original project was fully documented. It connected the 3rd supply chain node to a separate procurement cycle, in a way that suggested the original vulnerability was not isolated, but was one instance of a broader structural tendency. It was, if anything, more serious than the original finding. She knew, when she sent it, that it would require another meeting, another set of faces across a table. He was prepared for that. She was always prepared for that. What she was not entirely prepared for was the call she received 3 days after sending it. Not from a program aide, not from Frank Okafor's office, but from Cope's own number. He called at 08:15 on a Tuesday morning. She was in her home office with her second cup of coffee and the preliminary notes for a different project she was beginning to scope. She answered on the second ring. He said, Kane, I read it. She said, all of it. It was not a question. She already knew the answer from the fact that he had called 3 days after sending rather than 6 weeks, which was the normal cadence when someone sent a document to a senior official. He said, all of it. Twice. A pause. The connection between the third node and the procurement cycle. You're confident, she said, confident enough to write 41 pages about it. There was a pause. Then something happened that she had not expected, which was that General Arthur Cope, 34 years of service, wall of commendations, photographed with 4 presidents, laughed. It was a short sound, not warm exactly, but genuine in the way that unexpected things are genuine. It was the laugh of someone who had just been given an answer they had not anticipated, and who found the unexpectedness of it appropriate to the moment. He said, when can you be here? She said, when do you need me? He said, end of next week. She said, I'll be there. He said, bring Okafor if he's available. I want his technical eyes on the procurement angle. She said she would ask him. He said, good. And then, after a pause that was fractionally longer than his normal pauses, he said, the document. The methodology document. I've seen a lot of technical frameworks in 34 years. That one is different. She waited. He said, it should be taught. She said, I've been thinking the same thing. He said, let's talk about it when you're here. He ended the call the way he ended everything, without ceremony, the click of a man who had said what he needed to say and had moved on to the next thing. She set her phone down. She looked out the window of her home office, which faced a small yard with a tree that was just beginning to show the first pale signs of new growth. The morning was clear and cold, and the light on the tree was the particular quality of winter light that makes edges sharp and distances feel compressed. She thought about the methodology document. She thought about what it would mean to teach it, to build it into the way people learn to look at complex systems, the assumption gap identification, the simultaneous multi-node mapping, the discipline of looking in the space between systems rather than inside them. She thought about the 4 junior engineers she had trained over the years, and about how long it had taken her to develop the approach, and about how much faster it would have gone if someone had handed her the framework at the beginning. She thought about her father, Ray Kane, who had spent 26 years working with measurements and materials, and who had believed that knowing how something worked was the beginning of being able to make it work better, and who had spent many patient hours explaining structure to a child who had not yet understood that she was being given a method that would take her most of her career to fully use. She thought about a conference room where a general had looked at her and not seen her, and a badge that had turned face forward at the right moment, and the 31 minutes of questions that had followed, and the 3 sentences of an email, and a phone call at 08:15 on a Tuesday morning. She picked up her pen. She opened a new notebook to the first page. She wrote the date in small, neat numbers at the top. She had a lot of work to do. She was, as she had always been, looking forward to it.